kind of do our introductions and our interests in the topic. So,
yeah.
All right. All right, here we go. All right, welcome everybody. My name's John Buck. I'm part of the Bevry community, a place for open collaboration and discussion about interesting topics of philosophy and I guess somewhat politics, but mostly just existence in general. Today I am joined with Glenn Scrivener as well as Trygve Taringer. I never got your...
Taranger.
Taranger. Okay, it's close enough. Okay. And we're going to be discussing Slavoj Žižek's lecture Christian Atheism that he presented in 2017. What I'm going to be doing is kind of doing like clips from it, but we'll be able to pause it and discuss it as we go on. Glenn, if you'd like to sort of introduce yourself to our audience and maybe your interest in this sort of set of topics.
Sure. So I'm Glenn Scrivener. I'm Emma's husband. I'm Ruby and JJ's dad. I'm an Anglican minister. So I think maybe that's the crossover point with Christian atheism. I think John basically thought that the closest thing, surely, to Christian atheism would be to be a Church of England minister. So unfortunately, that's more true than he might even joke about. But so I've been kind of interacting with some of the meaning crisis and some of the issues around Jordan Peterson for the last few years, and was very interested in his debate with Žižek, and really looking forward to talking about Christian atheism.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of why I wanted to go to you, because I think that there's, especially within the UK and a lot of the European countries, there is sort of this aspect of nominal Christianity that isn't quite there within American sort of religiosity. But I think you'll probably have much closer ability to sort of speak to that from your own still perspective within the church. And also...
maybe.
Yeah. Trygve, if you'd like to sort of introduce yourself and your interest in these topics.
Yeah, so I'm a composer and amateur philosopher who's been following Jordan Peterson for some time and paying attention to what he's done and talk about. Mostly because I find that I think very much along the same lines as him. And when he came into discussion with Zizek, that obviously got my attention as well. And Christian atheism sounds like a pretty interesting idea, especially considering that people like Richard Dawkins has described himself as some kind of Christian atheist in recent years, which really goes to show that there's a lot of thought going on around just that topic. Myself, I'm also mostly on the atheist side of that discussion. I'm technically an atheist, but I think I'm much more sympathetic to religion than most.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Do you want to qualify maybe what you mean by atheist? Just because I know sometimes that gets used in different ways, and especially with your Petersonian background, I'm not sure.
Yeah. So the distinction would be between atheist and anti-theist. Mm-hmm. So an atheist is someone who doesn't believe in a god. I say I technically don't, because in no way do I rely on it. And an anti-theist is someone who thinks there should be no theism, who is actively working to get rid of that.
Right.
So my atheism is more of the agnostic kind, because I don't see a good case to be made for it.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. That's very helpful.
Not yet, Trygve. Not yet.
Yeah. By the end of the call, maybe we'll get you into an atheist Christian or something like that. All right. So
best of luck to you.
I'm just playing around. This is a video just for kind of going over these ideas from the various sorts of perspectives. Like I consider myself a theist, but in that sort of agnostic sort of variety that is hard to find myself believing in the full actual sense that a lot of most Christians and theists normally do. Okay, so this first clip is kind of his introduction to the series. It's going to go on for maybe about 10 minutes, but we can pause it in whenever we want as we go through. But he sort of starts off the discussion with kind of pointing out these, I guess, overlappings of anniversaries between Marxist history and in, say, the Russian Revolution, as well as the release of Das Kapital, and also the Maoist insurrection that
Shanghai uprising or something.
Right. Yeah. So all of these sorts of things overlapping. But he also drew in this sort of fourth overlap that he sees in connection to the history of Marxism, in Luther's nailing of his theses upon the door. I'm not exactly sure the exact history, but he sees that as sort of the most significant event in all of religious history, as that sort of rejection of the Catholic authority, which he sees as almost, in a sense, a culmination of Christianity, or something like that. Anyway, so we're going to start the clip at 5 minutes and 22 seconds. Let me make sure I get that exactly right. Oh, missed it. All right, here we go.
Anniversary of 1517, when Martin Luther put on that door the 95 Theses, Protestantism. And I still think that the Protestantism is the key, the greatest religious event that you can imagine. Why? Let me begin in a very simplified way, but I'm not totally bluffing, because I presented a version of this text in at a theological colloquium in Cambridge, and it went well, what can I say? So I'm not totally bluffing. Let me begin by this triad of Orthodoxy, Catholicism, and Protestantism. The way I see it, maybe I'm wrong, central to the Orthodox tradition is the notion of Theosis, of man becoming like God. Or to quote Saint Athanasius of Alexandria, quote, "He, Christ, or God, was incarnate so that we might be made God." End of quote. What should otherwise seem absurd, that fallen, sinful man may become holy as God is holy, has been made possible through Jesus Christ, who is God incarnate. And then Saint Maximus the Confessor wrote in the same vein, again a quote, "A sure warrant for looking with hope to deification of human nature is provided by the incarnation of God, which makes man God to the same degree as God himself became man. Let us become the image of the one whole God, bearing nothing earthly in ourselves, so that we may consort with God and become gods, receiving from God our existence as gods." End of quote. This orthodox formula, God became man so that man becomes God, is, I think, what Protestantism radically rejects. The deepest insight of Protestantism, although it's implicit already in the Bible, is that, to put it very simply, God became man and that's it. Nothing more. Everything already happens in the incarnation. What needs to be added is just a shift of perspective. I think that in authentic Christian vision, there is no resurrection to follow. Holy Ghost already is resurrection. Resurrection happens in the Christian community. God dies and he remains dead. We are condemned to freedom. Holy community is not, I read here Christianity in a radically atheist way. Holy Ghost is not some kind of a synthesis, God, man, and then they are brought together. No, with crucifixion, precisely that type of God, this primitive idea, up there then is a great old guy with a long beard who takes care of us, so don't worry too much, ultimately we are taken care of. That's what Hegel, my favorite, puts it nicely. He says, what dies on the cross is not an earthly representative of God. It's God himself, that God of beyond. So what remains? We, in our freedom. And that.
So that's probably a good sort of starting point, that he kind of brings up how within, especially Orthodox theology, the understanding of God becomes man so that man could be with God or become God in a sense.
Could become God. Yeah.
Yeah. Theosis, which is pretty remarkable, and he brings up how that is just kind of a radical notion to a lot of Protestants that man can become God. And like, no, there was only one incarnation, only one God, and the very notion of you becoming God with him is just kind of completely unheard of. But he makes the additional kind of argument that the death, the crucifixion on the cross is like this kind of a complete radical shift in our very understanding of what God is. Like from the previous sort of understanding within Judaism, you have God as the sort of ultimate guy who's pulling the strings on everything. But with Christianity, with the crucifixion, that sort of understanding of God as being this, I don't know, worker above us is kind of left aside, so that it puts humans in a much more, I guess, central role in the workings of the universe than just sort of reliance upon God. I don't know. Those are kind of my understandings of what he was bringing up, but interested in your guys' thoughts.
As a total Žižek novice, it's like I'd love to hear from you guys. Like, how do you actually read him? Because when he says things like, there is no resurrection in the Protestant understanding, it was all accomplished at the cross, and obviously no Protestant thinker, Luther and Calvin weren't saying that. So obviously he means that there are historical forces going on underneath the reformers. So that what they were chipping away at, they thought they were chipping away at certain aspects of the Roman Catholic doctrines, but actually they were buying into an atheistic conception. Like, is that how we should read him? Is that what he's saying?
To me, it seems like he's always pointing out like the authentic, like it seems like within Christianity, he's saying that like if we are taking the sort of Christian understanding seriously to its fullest extent, then we should become atheists in a sort of sense. And I think his reasoning is that like because the Christian revolution was so radical that if you're not applying it fully, then you're not really becoming a Christian. And so like that it's an interesting sort of prospect. Like, he considers himself a Christian atheist, that like as an atheist, that is sort of the Christianity taken to its
endpoint
core. Yeah. That you can't have this sort of reliance upon this higher deity, and even brings up how the sort of the Christian sort of way of being is to be in that kind of place of Christ on the cross of Eli Eli
Lama Sabachthani.
Yeah.
Lama Sabachthani. Yeah.
Lama
my God, why have you forsaken me?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
The cry of dereliction, it's often called.
Yeah, that very sort of moment is to be an atheist in a sort of sense, and if Christ is divine, then to be in that sort of moment is to kind of share in that sort of divine being. And that's his sort of understanding of what it means to be a Christian atheist.
Right. Trigger,
can I just add something to this? Because this thing about atheism, as we know it anyway, being kind of the truest expression of, in Zizek's view, apparently Protestantism, is actually very, very similar to something you find in Nietzsche. So Nietzsche's analysis of morality in the genealogy of morals leads him towards an argument that what separates atheists from Christians today is that atheists are more dedicated to truth, which is one of the synonyms for Christ. So they're more dedicated to the truth side of Christ than Christians, as we know it today. So in that sense, he's saying the same thing, that atheism is a more true expression of Christianity. Mm-hmm. And but when tied together with what Zizek seems to be saying later in this lecture, I think was this lecture, that he seems to think that the atheism we know today could only come out of Christianity, That's an interesting parallel.
Yeah, yeah. And Catholics say it all the time as well. They kind of say, they'll say to me as a Protestant, you schismatic, ever since 1517, you've been chipping away at the truth, and the end product is atheism. Well done, Protestants. And yeah, so I mean, Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher, is a Catholic, and he's written sort of The Secular Age, and he's made a very compelling case that what you do. So Luther kind of gets rid of some of the bells and whistles of Roman Catholic worship, and then evermore you strip away praying for the saints and praying for the dead, and you strip away Mariolatry, and you strip away all these sort of accoutrements of the Roman Catholic faith, and then people keep on stripping away through the Enlightenment. They strip away biblical authority, they strip away the doctrine of the Trinity, they get back to Christ as simply a human, and it's just about the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of all men. And then it's a hop, skip, and a jump until you've gotten rid of God himself. Therefore, atheism is just hyper-Protestantism. That's an argument commonly made, as you say, by people as disparate as Nietzsche and as a Roman Catholic apologist sometimes.
yeah, it's fascinating to really kind of wrap your head around.
But I would say, speaking as a Protestant, I would say that actually the language that's used within Protestantism is different from what the Orthodox would say in terms of theosis, or some people would talk about divinization. And he's absolutely right to point out that Protestants get a little bit antsy about that language. But when you get a Protestant onto the language of union with Christ, we're all over that. Calvin was all over that. The Reformers, the Puritans were all over that. That in this spiritual, mystical union with Christ, I stand with him, and I have his Father as my Father, and I have his Spirit as my Spirit. And for the Protestant, if you're sufficiently Trinitarian, well, then that is the divine nature, right? The divine nature is a father with his son in the union of the Spirit. So that to stand with Christ and to be united to Jesus by faith is to be divinized, is to experience theosis. It's just that a lot, especially in the Calvinist tradition, there's this sort of very strong philosophical idea that the finite cannot contain the infinite. And that's a kind of a very strong axiomatic statement that Lutherans themselves disagree with. Lutherans would say, on the other hand, and they are much more open to language of theosis, actually, at times, that of course the finite can contain the infinite, because look at the manger. There is the baby Jesus. Like, what do you call him? He's God, right? So within Protestantism, there's lots of different ways that people take that. But I don't think that Protestants have jettisoned entirely this idea of theosis. It's just that, some Calvinists, and I'm from the Calvinist tradition myself, but some Calvinists get a bit antsy about merging the creator-creature distinction. So he's right to some degree, but I just want to push back a little bit.
Right. I see, at least with somebody with maybe more traditionalistic Christian leanings, that there's, within Protestantism, I mean, within the very name itself, it's protesting against, say, the Catholic Church, is this sort of rejection of any sort of earthly spiritual authority, towards having some sort of, say, like with Zizek, his understanding of Protestantism is this radical egalitarian sort of community of each person having this personal direct connection with God. Whereas within sort of more traditional understandings of Christianity, there is the church, and the church is sort of the symbol of, it has a very hierarchical organization of, you have your spiritual father, they have a spiritual father who ultimately has the ultimate spiritual father. But I think that it's connected to sort of the way that we sort of symbolically understand the world. So like, in order to live out the Christian understanding of, say, being the bride of Christ, you have to have some sort of connection there of who you're living in subordination to some higher authority, and then from there there's an order to things that you have. Whereas and I mean, the Protestants make a good point that Christ, in his sort of rejection of the rabbinic Judaism of the time, is sort of a radical egalitarian figure in a sort of sense, that rejecting that sort of spiritual hierarchical order to things. And I don't know, there is that, I guess, tension between the Orthodox understanding of Christianity and the Protestant understanding. And like that the case can be made that within Protestantism, the very rejection of this sort of spiritual authority can lead one to sort of being one's own spiritual guide. And in a sense, that's like atheism, where you don't require any sort of higher moral authority over yourself to guide your actions.
Like I said about being technically atheists, I don't rely on God for anything.
Right.
At least in conceptually.
Right.
Yeah, and I guess what we'll see is, like in a sense, so Tryggve, do you think when he says that the atheism we tend to have, or the atheisms that we tend to inherit in the West, are of a particularly Christian kind? Would you agree to that?
I think that's very plausible. I mean, if you look at traditions for how people treated atheism, the overwhelming consensus, whether you look at Islam or ancient Greece or wherever, seems to be that atheists should be executed on the spot, basically. So that seems to suggest a very different conception of what atheism entails than what we see today, because modern atheists, at least on the surface, can function like any others, and don't need to be executed in any obvious ways, at least. I should hope.
Just cancelled.
I wonder if the reasoning for that is just the fact that the church has lost its political power. Like, if it were the case that the church was still in its spiritual, in its sort of reigning superiority over the West, that there would be that. So I don't know. It's just another way to sort of look at that. I don't know.
And but to bring in Nietzsche, though, I do think his critique holds that certainly humanistic forms of atheism are pretty much Christianity light. They are pretty much the Diet Cola of Christianity, in that they've swapped out God and they've swapped in the idea of the good with a capital G. But they're pretty much talking about similar concepts and similar conceptions of what the good is, in terms of charity and humility and kindness and self-sacrifice and these sorts of things that sort of sit at odds with the moral philosophies of the Greco-Roman world. So in that sense as well, I would say that modern atheisms are quite Christian.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Mm-hmm. And to also point out one more thing about Nietzsche on that front, he suggested that it was specifically in the dedication to truth, and that for this reason, atheism would never destroy Christianity, because it was still dedicated to that same core. Because again, the life, the truth, and the way. I may have forgotten the order, but Christ is all those things. He is the pinnacle of Christianity, or whatever you want to call it, the core. So that puts truth at the core of Christianity, by implication.
Right.
So if you have to believe something you can't believe is true, then you can't be a Christian, presumably.
Right. Yeah, this is, I think, one of the harshest problems with Christianity right now, as it is a lot of people, and I'm sure, Glenn, you can speak on this, they don't have the capacity, or at least they don't feel within them the capacity to be able to believe in God or in the resurrection of Jesus, just because it's just something so outside of their scope of being able to believe things. And if that's the thing, like, in order to be a Christian, you have to hold to these certain beliefs, then it's hard to really consider yourself a Christian. But yeah, I've heard from different people within very secular countries like Sweden or the UK that has still Christian, they are Christian, but their belief is non-propositional in a sort of sense. I think it's referred to as like theological non-cognitivism, where your religious beliefs need not interfere or interact at all with your beliefs about how the world is. Like, there's a difference between believing in God or rather than believing that God exists. Like, you can have one without the other, and it's I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with that sort of turn within the sort of more secular countries?
No, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I think one of the benefits, though, of Christianity is that the truth remains outside yourself. One of the traps that Protestants sometimes fall into is, we're very strong and we're saved by faith and by faith alone. And some Protestants take that to be, okay, faith is a thing that I need to work up within myself. And it's this muscle that I need to flex, and it's a power within myself to grasp hold of things. Whereas Luther originally was constantly telling us that the truth lies outside yourself. And literally it's about just saying, amen, all right, I surrender, whatever. It's not me, it's you. That idea of faith, I guess, I think is a lot easier to kind of accept than some Protestant forms of faith, where you've got to get your dogma correct and you've got to tick off every line of the doctrinal statement. As though, at the pearly gates, you get into heaven by, getting a theology, exam correct. That has been a problem within Protestantism. But hopefully the external fact of Christ being the truth. Another thing that I try to rely on in a more secular country, so I'm from Australia, but I live in the UK, is to do a kind of a Tom Holland type thing. If you know him, he's a not the actor, the historian Tom Holland, who's just written a big fat book called Dominion, about the Christian revolution that has built the West. And what he's constantly pointing out, and what I'm trying to constantly point out, is that all the assumptions that we have about equality and diversity and inclusion, and about what the good life looks like, about there being a shape to history and being on the right side of history and the wrong side of history, and just some very basic concepts that we just live with, that we think of as natural, are profoundly Christian. It's the water that we swim in. And what I find, talking with people, is that actually so many of their instincts have been built by this Christian revolution. And it's kind of my job is to help them trace it back to its roots. Because I don't think you get some of these dearly held beliefs without the God on the cross. And so I'm constantly just trying to say, in a sense, you already have some very developed faith positions. If you believe in any way in human rights, if you believe in any way in human dignity, or that kind of thing, the equality of all members of the human family, for instance, that's an incredibly theological belief that you have that is emphatically not empirically derived. Like you didn't look at humanity and come to the conclusion that they were equal, because they're not equal in any way, shape, or form. Right. Where does their equality exist?
Or should we say, in no obvious way?
In no obvious way, right? And as Jordan Peterson would say, it's something that you need to attribute to that person, and then you act on account of that. You act on the basis of that, and it turns out society flourishes in an incredible way.
Treat people like you treat fires.
People like, sorry?
Treat people like you treat fires.
Truth fires?
Yes.
Like you treat fires. If you don't treat them properly, they burn your house down or kill you.
Right. But if you do treat people as though they have, what in Jordan Peterson's language, the spark of divinity, or in Genesis chapter 1 language, the imago Dei, the image of God, that seems to be a faith commitment on the basis of which you act. Mm-hmm. And the world seems to come into alignment. And I want to say to people, maybe it seems like that faith commitment, therefore, is true. So you already have a capacity within you to believe things that are not empirically demonstrable, because it's not directly, the equality of the human race is not at all, directly observable. But we have this cultural memory, at least, of having a faith commitment on the basis of which we live our lives. Well, how about actually earthing that in the God who became man for all men, that we all might become God, right? There seems to be a metaphysical grounding for a moral belief that most of us seem to take for granted.
Right? Yes, but that is not adequate for a lot of people today, and the reason is because they can't tell for sure what came first, this event, or the conditions that made that event something that people could think of. Say, if these principles came from God, let's say, or if they came from something that might replace God in that sentence, say for example, reality as such, and this would be something that is targeted by natural selection. Evolutionary theory is a very powerful tool when it comes to explaining things.
Yes.
And it can actually explain these kinds of principles too. It's just a little bit more diffuse. The thing is that when you do that, you don't need God in the picture, and so certainly, even if those things could lead to God, they don't have to.
Well, I would say, survival of the fittest, and therefore the sacrifice of the weakest, is the inverse of the Christian claim, which is that the fittest was sacrificed for the survival of the weakest.
Though I would point out that's actually just the typical misunderstanding of evolutionary theory. The fittest isn't anything like the strongest, so it is not the sacrifice of the weakest, unless you don't understand evolutionary theory. Rather, it is the survival of the people who are most fit, in the sense that they are suited for the situation they are in.
Right.
No matter what that situation is, and it's completely individual.
Right. But our moral instincts aren't simply that we favor the most intellectually powerful. It's not just that we favor the person who's the greatest coder. It's
way more complicated.
Yeah. But we seem to want to prize and protect and give hospitality to even the weakest member who contributes nothing to the tribe.
Yeah.
Unless we're Nietzschean, because I do think Nietzsche saw things quite clearly, in that maybe we don't want to offer to that individual our provision and protection and hospitality. Maybe we let that guy go to the wall because he's holding us back.
Right.
We seem to have inherited some kind of sense that is an immoral thing to do.
Yeah. And there's actually a case for that through evolutionary theory as well, which is one of the reasons why I find it so hard to go to Christianity when you have alternate explanations. But I don't think we should go into detail on that, because I think it's kind of off topic.
Yeah, it is interesting to point out that there's kind of the difference between an explanation of how we have these sorts of moral intuitions or feelings for things versus what are the metaphysical understandings of the world that make these moral intuitions actually make sense, and like whether they can be true in a sense. Like Nietzsche sort of brings up that the whole Christian values don't really make sense in a non-Christian universe. Like you're just subverting the Übermensch of like what humanity could become by including sort of the weakest of the group as part of it. Or actually, you're subverting what the fullness of what humanity could become by sort of holding these the aspect of being weak as some sort of virtue. Like that's sort of Nietzsche's understanding of Christianity, is that it sort of deified the weakness as a virtue.
And the victim, right?
Yeah, exactly.
There's a divine victim at the heart of Christianity.
And that's something that we see quite significantly even within sort of this post-Christian secularity, that value is still quite prominent, even more so, exactly as Nietzsche was sort of critiquing within Christianity, that to be a victim puts you at sort of the top of the moral hierarchy in some sense, that whoever is the victim of some sort of oppressor, their I don't know, existence.
Victimhood makes right.
Yeah, exactly.
And therefore, if Žižek is right, and I don't think he is, but if he's right that Protestants just have God coming down and dying,
right,
and not rising again,
well, that they don't need anything else. That's the essence of it. Then you don't need him to resurrect because he's already there in the Holy Spirit. That's what he said, right?
Yes. Yeah. No. Yes. Exactly. But if that is the trajectory down, then no wonder you might get a hyper Protestantism in which the victim becomes prized and sacred, and no one actually wants to rise up in order to share with the weak of society. It's a race to the bottom.
Right.
It's the oppression Olympics, right? Because everyone's competing to be the victim rather than to be the one who, through sacrifice, is actually able from a position of fullness to serve the victim. So I think Žižek is onto something. If there is any trajectory, and I don't think we should identify it fully with Protestantism, but I think there is a trajectory that he's identifying, and what we might be seeing right now on the streets of America right now is the working out of some of that.
Yeah, and an interesting observation here. If it looks trace this through the idea of the victim as who is right, that the victimhood gives you moral authority, then that comes into that challenges Nietzsche's idea, right? Because Nietzsche thought that it was the adherence to truth that that made atheists out of Christians, and so he was concerned that at some point people will start wondering, to what end do we suffer, and wouldn't find a good answer in truth through that, and so they would just embrace nihilism basically and just stop caring completely, and that is clearly not what has happened. So it might be that that one of the other factors, and not just truth, has seen some expression. If we look at the truth, the life, and the way, is there anything we can trace from there to victimhood? Do you see anything?
So I lost the argument at that point. Sorry. Can you put it in another way?
Okay, so in Nietzsche's analysis, it was the truth aspect of Christianity's ideal that was expressed in atheism. But it is not what we're seeing right now. And maybe we should also note that it is not only from atheists that we see it right now. We see it also within Christian communities. But this idea of elevating the victim has grown very powerful in recent years. There's no denying that. So is there any way we could trace that back to Christianity's ideals as something that might be taken on by atheism as well? What do you think? Or do you think it's just something that people have kept without thinking about it?
I think it's a deeply Christian. It's still the water that we swim in. You know, George Floyd choked to death at the hands of the state. There was an executioner, and it was quite like an execution, and someone representing the powers that be choked righteous George Floyd to death. You know,
or at the very least, the absolute very least, it looked like that happened.
Yes. Certainly he did choke. We'll let the courts do what they do, but so what I'm giving is the why did that light the touch paper and things? I still think we are a civilization built on the sacred victim, and therefore that story just is going to resonate with people at a much deeper level than anyone understands, really, anyone consciously articulates even.
Yeah, if we look at Haidt here, in his analysis of moral theory and psychology, he suggests his moral foundations, right? And he seems to suggest early in The Righteous Mind that in a weird situation, so Western educated, industrialized, rich democracy situation, like what you see at most universities, most of the moral foundations have no rational argument in their case. They basically just appeal to emotion. But harm does not. Harm is something that is observable, that everybody understands, that nobody should experience without a good reason. It is one of the easiest to defend on intellectual grounds, and so perhaps perhaps the harm to the victim is why that has become so powerful, and that has nothing to do with either Christianity or atheism as such, but is rather just something that is fundamental to humanity, that survived the intellectual picking away that happened during the last 1,000 years.
But Haidt is observing the moral taste buds. So in The Righteous Mind, he talks about these various spectra that people kind of line up on. One of which being care versus harm. But he's being observational about Western civilization, and so I don't think it's obvious that this is humanity in its natural state. If we could go to some Rousseauian, natural, like we can't get there. What we can do is we can look at ancient history, and we can look at what the Persians thought of as the good life. We can look at what the Stoics thought of as the great virtues. We can look at what the Epicureans thought of as the good life. We can look at what Muslims, traditionally have thought of. But I think the prizing of the victim stands out very starkly from Persian, Greek, Roman, Muslim understandings.
And sure. So let's say that this is something that was kept from Christianity because it wasn't something you could chip away at with rational arguments in the same way that sanctity, for example, could be picked away at.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It was kept from Christianity? In what sense?
That it was something people absorbed from Christianity over 1,000 years, period, plus. And that when challenged by atheist critics and other intellectuals, it held up, unlike sanctity.
Right.
At least in the common conception.
Like it doesn't require any sort of theological or metaphysical underpinnings that most of the other Christian virtues are supported by. Because it's just the fact that when you're harmed, you experience it directly and empirically, and so you can sort of build up.
And if you empathize with other people, you understand what it's like for them to be harmed, and you probably don't want that.
Right. Yeah.
Right, but the universalizing of that isn't immediately obvious.
Yes, which is why I say sure. Let's say it came from Christianity and it was kept because it's withstood the criticisms.
Mm-hmm. But Haidt does a good job of making a case for all the different moral taste buds, and from evolutionary theory itself.
Absolutely.
And he says that those on the right tend to preserve all 5 or 6 of them, and those on the left tend to preserve only 2 of them.
Or employ, let's say they actively use them, and it's not really the case either. If you look at sanctity, there's absolutely a case to be made for some things being sacred to the left as well as the right. Mm-hmm. It's just different things. And if you can say that about sanctity, can you say that about the other ones as well?
Possibly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Probably.
It's hard to see loyalty and authority quite within the left, or even I can definitely understand what your point in that there are certain things that are sacred, certainly taboo to discuss within sort of the leftist ish bubble. I don't know if you had that same sort of aspect of respect for authority or loyalty.
It's authoritarianism.
Maybe, for example, the authority is placed on something else that it lines up with what is sacred, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, and I suppose any sort of disagreement, any sort of moral disagreement, there would have to be some sort of reliance upon the authority, and so within sort of within that sort of progressive mentality, the authority goes to whoever is being oppressed. All right, we'll move on to the lecture. I think it's let me get the exact time code. It's 15 minutes and 22 seconds, I think, or 15 minutes and 30 seconds. I'll move that.
One question: how many of these? How many clips have we cut up for us to talk about?
I think 4, and not all of them are going to be too long. So let me see.
Okay.
There we go. Okay.
Introduces immediately an element of handling, of financial transaction. I see that child drowning, should I do it or not? Well, I may gain salvation, so fuck it, why not do it, It makes our good deeds part of almost, I would say...
Sorry, I should introduce this a little bit better. He is sort of discussing how... In typical understanding of morality, of why do something good, and he's...
You can trade yourself to being a good person.
Yeah, let me back it up a little bit more just to give it a little bit more of a context. Say 15:6.
God decided in advance, you are redeemed, you are lost, totally irrespective of what we are doing. And I think this is the right line. I think that as intelligent Protestants saw it, this Catholic way of linking our salvation to our good works introduces immediately an element of handling, of financial transaction. I see the child drowning, should I do it or not? Well, I may gain salvation, so fuck it, why not do it, you know?
Question. Glenn, do you agree with that?
I think the Protestants, I think what Luther said is that God does not need your good works, your neighbor does. And therefore, if you're freely given Christ and in Christ all salvation, then there is no vertical ascent that I need to make towards heaven. And I think it's true then that the way is clear for me now. God does not need my good deeds, my neighbor does. I can be good for goodness sakes, as opposed to good for whatever eternal gain I get out of it. So to that degree, I agree.
Right. So is it kind of like going against this, like this sort of Protestant understanding of like why be good is not for selfish reasons. Like you're not going to earn your salvation by being good and helping your neighbor at all, but it's
virtue ethics, good for goodness sake.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, even virtue ethics, there's sort of the sense of like the reason you're good is so that it helps you to exist.
Yeah, depends on the frame, right? But still, it's a kind of virtue ethics.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, we'll continue the clip because he brings up.
It makes our good deeds part of almost, I would say, financial investment into future. No, but as Luther put it very intelligently, if there is predestination, then the solution is pure goodness. Because you see a child drowning, sorry for this pathetic example, and you know very well that it will not help your salvation in any way if you help the child or not. So it's only goodness that makes you do it. Sorry, we are here. Yes. So. Let's go on here. What in this position where the solution is not some kind of a reunification of God with man, we overcome our alienation of God through a simple realization that God is already alienated from himself, self-abandon. I like to apply here to divinity Hegel's wonderful reading of ancient Greek statues which are impenetrable for us, like what does the Sphinx mean? And you know what's Hegel's formula? The secrets of ancient Greeks, secrets for us, were already secrets for ancient Greeks themselves. And
sorry, yeah, he goes on to discuss Hegel, which is kind of less relevant to our discussion. But yeah, he brings up kind of that point that within Protestantism, to be good is to be good for goodness sake, rather than for any sort of like selfish or inherent like wanting to earn your salvation through indulgences or even how you act, but rather like it gives, I guess, a more altruistic reasoning behind why be good in the first place that is kind of lost, I think, within the sort of more, I don't want to say narcissistic.
So you say rational?
Huh?
Rational?
Well, I was just going to say within the sort of more Orthodox or Catholic understanding, especially, like, that's the very reason that Luther was sort of going up against the Catholic churches because of the indulgences.
On that note, he discussed Orthodox Christianity's essence in Theosis, and he discussed Protestantism's rejection, but what did he attribute to Catholicism again? Catholicism.
He didn't. he like brought up these 3 points as like the difference between the three, but he didn't actually bring up what the Catholic sort of primary.
That's what I thought.
I don't know. Glenn,
do you have any ideas, Glenn?
Yeah.
You probably know more about this than us.
Well, it's often sort of said that in the New Testament, your assurance of being saved is a fact. In Catholicism, to be assured of your salvation is a sin, which is true. And in Protestantism, to be assured of your within sort of hyper-Protestantism, Puritanism, to be assured of your salvation is your duty. And this is kind of where Žižek Žižek goes on, to talk about, actually, now that I'm freed, there is such a thing as predestination. I don't know whether I'm one of the elect, and so counterintuitively, you get the Protestant work ethic out of a Protestant belief in being saved once and for all. I thought that was interesting. Although Luther himself really didn't go into predestination at all. It was more of a Calvinist thing. Luther's quite famous for saying, don't think about predestination. Like Lutherans are much more happy with tension and mystery in their philosophical thought than Calvinists. Calvinists want to nail everything down and end up with, at times, certainly with some hyper-Calvinists, some very unpleasant, sort of doctrine. So I don't think he's right to call it predestination that does the job that he thinks that it does. But certainly the idea that I'm saved by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone, that really does sort out the vertical dimension of my relationship with God and free me up for the horizontal. So to that degree, I think it's correct.
Yeah, it's interesting. He brings up the sort of, I guess, this weird paradox where you might assume, like, just from commonplace understanding of like predestination or fatalism, that, whatever my actions are going to be is not due to anything of my own, but rather God's decree or the deterministic nature of the universe or anything like that. So what the hell, I can do whatever I want, or it's like whatever happens, and I have no real concern with that. But the point he brings up is that, like, well, no, you there's this sort of level of, like, you don't know what your predetermined fate is going to be. And the paradox is that despite the sort of assumption we might have towards fatalism, is that within Protestantism, capitalism sort of flourished. And capitalism is like the most active sort of ideology you could kind of have in that, like, you're always doing something, and like within Protestant sects there's quite a significant amount of like charity work and missions work and evangelicism that takes place that you don't really find as much within the more like within the Orthodox Church especially. It's like the best kept secret within Christianity that there even is a Orthodox Church within America. It's a weird sort of paradox that because your fate is not accessible to you in a sort of sense from like your own understanding, that gives you a sort of freedom to be as good as you can be, even though you know it's not going to give you provide you for.
It's going to change
salvation.
anything.
Yeah, it's weird. I can't even understand the exact, I guess, reasoning behind it, like how it can even make sense to me. But maybe it doesn't make sense to Protestants, but it's effective.
Well, I don't think it's actually predestination that's doing the work here. I think it's the graciousness of God's gift of salvation. That what is it that you could ever give to God anyway? Doesn't he own everything anyway? Like what could I possibly give to God that he doesn't already own himself? Therefore, if it's from God's fullness that he gives me everything, including his son in death and blood, and then he pours out his spirit on me, God is just giver. He is never a recipient from me, ever. Therefore, before God, I am purely a recipient, and that's what faith is. But then Luther was so clear to say, before the world, I am a lover. So it is faith, which is receiving from God, and it is love, which is pouring out to the world. And that is the Christian life. And there's an economic counterpart to that, which is that, what do I do with my money?
Right.
Well, in ancient times, what do you do with your money? You either bury it because you're afraid, or you build statues to yourself, and you show off your bling. You display your wealth because of pride.
Like we still do today from time to time.
We do it, but we've discovered a third thing that you can do with your wealth, which is invest it.
Yeah.
Which is to actually put it to work. And isn't it interesting how Jesus uses analogies about parables about the talents? You're given talents, which was just a unit of currency.
Yeah.
And what are you meant to do? You're meant to invest it. You're meant to put it to work. And so it's really this idea of receiving from above and pouring outwards.
Making the most of it.
Yeah. Well, I think free grace does lead to free markets, and I think you can draw that kind of link. Yeah.
Sure. That makes sense.
Yeah. It's interesting then that Zizek, being a neo-Marxist, he's more Hegelian, he says. I
think he's more Žižek than anything else.
Yeah, right. Yeah. That he's drawn then towards this sort of Christian Protestantism rather than, say, more within Orthodoxy or Catholicism. Because of that, it's confusing because of that kind of close connection that you can see between capitalism and Protestantism.
Especially when you would think that within Catholicism there's a lot more of a tradition of distributism and
right.
more communistic kind of conceptions of things. You go back to the Book of Acts where the church was just sharing everything and whereas that's kind of neglect. Like in my own denomination, Church of England, within the 39 Articles of Faith, which is our doctrinal sort of standard, one of them is that the goods are not to be held in common.
Specifically.
Right, specifically. Because coming out of an historical context in which I think Žižek mentions about Munzer and kind of some of the radical Reformation and a lot of the Anabaptists, and there are a lot of sort of communistic forms of society that were growing up, and not in the Church of England. We're not going to have that here. So, goods are not to be held in common is actually part of our Anglican doctrinal statement.
So is it just to sort of distinguish the Church of England did it to distinguish themselves from sort of these other cultish or sects that are doing this particular thing?
Yeah, all the magisterial reformers. It was interesting, Luther spent a lot of his early years obviously kind of against the Pope, but then to shore up the movement, he did spend a lot of time kind of saying, "Oh, but we don't go that far," and we're not with the Anabaptists, and we're not, we're not with the Peasants' Revolt and things like that, which is what happens in all sorts of revolutions, isn't it? But
yeah.
Basically saying we had a cause to go far, but not this far.
Right. This far and no further.
Yeah. That's perfect. Okay. Let's see. So that was that clip. I have another one that's right. This one going into. Actually, I want to play the last portion of a clip that I had going into sort of Kantian duties as. Let me see. Where's the right time for that? Let's say 25.
I had to do it. That's freedom. So that's my first point about Protestantism, which means that not only you are free, but you are even more free than you thought. You are even responsible for your fate, for your necessity. And again, as I already explained in my classes, here psychoanalysis rejoins Protestantism, because in psychoanalysis the obvious result is something like predestination. I think I'm a free being, but no, everything is predetermined through my past traumas, through whatever, So I discovered that I'm not free. And this was the fashionable lesson half a century ago with that fashion of structuralism in France. This is how psychoanalysis was read. Structural psychoanalysis. You think you are a free subject? No. You are just a puppet. The big other, the symbolic order, runs the game, and so on. But no. Lacan follows here Freud. Yes, you are overdetermined, but you cannot use this overdetermination or psychic necessity which makes you what you are. You cannot use it as an excuse, to be vulgar, I'm sorry. I rape a child, and then I say to the judges, sorry guys, what can I do? I was overdetermined by my unconscious complex. No, you are predestined by fate, but you are responsible even for that. You are much more radically responsible. And I can't go into it now. I already did it in my class to develop how the same goes also for, that's why it's a great thing, Kantian ethics. When Kant says, du kannst, then du sollst. You can do it because you must do it. Like, no excuse to not do your duty. If it's your duty, you have to do it. But Kant, this is not so often noticed, goes even a step further. He also implies that even doing your duty cannot be an excuse for doing your duty. Like, Chris, I hate you, let me do, like, I have to do something, it's my duty, which will hurt you. I don't have the right to tell you, sorry guy, but it's my duty. No, I don't have the right to externalize it. I'm not responsible only to do my duty. I have to fully subjectively assume also my duty in the sense of what is my duty. This is why, incidentally, I mentioned this briefly in my class, and now I will stop with plagiarizing myself. Don't worry, I will not repeat my class. This is why I think that although I admire her, at some point in her otherwise wonderful Eichmann in Jerusalem, if I remember it correctly, Hannah Arendt was wrong. When she took seriously Eichmann's statement that he was just a good Kantian. He did his duty. For him, duty was embodied in Führer's orders. So, sorry, I was doing my duty. No, Eichmann did precisely the wrong thing. He was not a Kantian, because he did something that Kant strictly prohibits. He used duty as an excuse. Sorry, I helped killing millions of Jews. What can I do? That's my duty. No, you cannot refer to your duty as some objective determination that you have just to follow. You are radically responsible for your duty.
I mean, it is the pattern though of New Testament ethics. You know, you'll get the Apostle Paul writing all these letters where he will go through, perhaps like in his letter to Ephesus, in the letter to the Ephesians, he will talk about your utter helplessness, and then you've been raised with Christ, seated in the heavenly realms, filled with the Holy Spirit, and he takes 3 chapters to sort of say all that about your fullness, and then he says, let us now walk in step with the Lord out into the world. And it's this sort of sense that you have been possessed, taken up, not because of your own goodness, but actually on account of your own badness. You had to be taken up. You had to be possessed by the Spirit. And now what can you do except live this new life of love? You've been filled. What can you do except overflow? You've fallen in love. What can you do except what lovers do? Which is, act on behalf of it. And it was interesting. Are you going to play a clip where Žižek talks about faith and falling in love? Right. You don't jump in love. Yeah. What else could you do? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The idea is that choice matters. That no matter how predestined we might be to do what we do, our choice in the matter still matters, and we should choose what we think is right. That's the idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. And I think he does talk about in the lecture what an impoverished view of freedom it is, just to have a freedom of choice. You know, I could get strawberry ice cream or vanilla or chocolate. You know, what kind of choice is that? And more we're discovering, you know, the paradox of choice and how we can actually be paralyzed.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Too many choices. What to do?
Right. And so freedom can't simply, consist in my atopic independence and just ability to do whatever I can. It's got to be something more about being acting in accordance with my nature, acting in such a way that I'm most truly myself because I'm pursuing my true nature and not the other conflicting desires. And so there are desires that I could choose that would enslave me. And just because I choose them doesn't make me more free. I am liberated as I choose the good. I'm actually enslaved. However much I say, oh, I'm free to choose eating ice cream for the rest of my life, and whatever the health consequences. No, that enslaves me. There are choices that are not an expression of freedom at all, but actually it's opposite. Yeah.
And likewise, having too many choices as a composer, it's very close to home. When you sit down with a sheet of paper and you're going to write something, what to do? If you don't just start somewhere, you don't get anywhere.
Right.
So you have to make an arbitrary starting point, and rules really, really help with that decision making. So you might even say the more rules you have, the more opportunity do you have to make a free choice.
Right.
To choose what you think is right within those rules.
Yep. And to bring it into the realm of the personal relationship thing that Žižek talks about, people will often say to you, do you think there's just one right person for you? And people will ask me as a minister of religion, is there one right person that God has for me? I was like, I have no idea. Right up until the point where you walk down the aisle to, there are literally like billions of people for you, but the moment you say I do, there's one person for you. All right, that's and that's that. But then,
at least if you're honest.
At least if you're honest, yeah. If you stick to the rules. But I would say, it's so interesting in Europe. It's more of a thing, like the way you express your love. You put a lock on a bridge. Like you go over Paris, and there's all sorts of bridges over the River Seine, and there are padlocks everywhere with initials engraved in, because a sign of your love for that person is to say, I'm locked with this person. And sometimes. Exactly. And what you're meant to do is you're meant to lock it, and then you throw the key in the river. That's the symbolism.
Yeah.
Although sometimes you come across combination locks. I don't know what that's communicating. It's like, as soon as I figure this thing, I'm out of here. It's like, but yeah, freedom and enslaving yourself are quite close together in the things that really matter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If they say do anything, you do everything or nothing.
Right.
And you can't do everything.
Is the same as to do nothing. Yeah. It's like that the famous Simpsons episode where Homer goes up into space. Do you remember the one? And somehow he gets loose in zero gravity, and he's careering through the cabin, and he smashes into the ant farm that they're going to do experiments on. And the ants are chirruping to each other, and you don't know what they're saying, but there's subtitles beneath. And as they are released into zero gravity out of the ant farm, they just say, freedom, horrible, horrible freedom. It's like, yeah. Maybe there's a context in which you flourish and thrive, and maybe desiring to be outside the ant farm is the opposite of freedom. Yeah. No. No.
I tend to think of it as the freedom to act against recommendations.
That's good. That's good. But I think sometimes if it's freedom in independence, and in independence from the kind of relationships in which I find my identity, it's a hop, skip, and a jump from being free to being lost, isn't it? You do a Google image search of freedom. Just type freedom into the search bar, and you get, what's interesting is you get all sorts of individuals all by themselves, kind of on a horizon with their arms out, and they all look quite alone to me.
Yeah,
and,
I'm doing that right now. I can confirm.
Right. Yeah.
You also have a planet with the words freedom over it and nothing more. Just a planet, empty planet.
Alone. And perhaps never have we been more free in terms of our ability to do a job that our dad didn't do. Right. That had been everyone's existence right up until about 5 minutes ago. So we're very free in that sense, but we're very alone as well. Yeah.
A point from that I would like to make, that I would have wanted to make early in the conversation, but that I didn't really find the room to say. This idea about apotheosis, or no, not apotheosis, but just theosis that was discussed earlier. Is it just me, or is it a lot like Nietzsche's Übermensch?
Perhaps to bring it into this very recent conversation, I think theosis is very much to be wrapped up, filled with the Spirit, clothed in the Son, brought to the Father. Feels feels like you're being a lot more held than Nietzsche's Übermensch, in which you're free flying. Yeah. Mm. Mm.
We should view reality as, quote, iridescent chaos of a world before man. Now, I claim this doesn't mean cosmological speculation, how did Big Bang look? It means that take a phenomenon like Auschwitz and you look at it from outside of human concerns. Of course, let's not misunderstand me, it's an utterly obscene vision, because in some sense you cannot do it. And here I come to my next point. I will be very brief. I really don't want to spend too much time. I think that here Deleuze introduces, and he does it at some point, he explicitly uses the terms, the Kantian distinction between, for us, phenomenal reality and in itself, in the sense of noumenal, independent of us, not in this naive sense that in itself is reality out there the way it really is outside our view, but in itself as, I will put it like this, an impossible phenomenon. The problem with the vision of Auschwitz that I gave to you is not that you cannot claim, it's bluffing, that it's the way Auschwitz really was. No, it's still our view, but it's impossible view. It's too traumatic. As ethical human being, we cannot afford to look at reality in that way, where inmates are, the burned people there are just reduced to one among the actants together with worms and whatever. So my point is this one, that here Claude Lanzmann, with whom I often don't agree, I think, to shock you, that his Shoah, I find it very suspicious ethically. But at some point he was right. He wrote somewhere that if he were to discover, let's say that some Nazi sadist did it, if he were to discover movie, cinema, which direct shooting of the most brutal moments of Auschwitz. You see the bodies being gassed, and then how in panic mother climbs upon her child to be a little bit higher, to be gassed. You know, the most brutal moments. He said, I would burn it immediately. And he is right. You see too much there. But you see the point. It's not that you see objective reality the way it's seen. You see a phenomenon. It's still a phenomenon. But a phenomenon which cannot be integrated into our reality. Okay, that's...
Okay. Sorry, guys. I for the people watching on stream, I think that last portion, my mic was muted on the stream part. So I didn't say anything worthwhile, but it was mostly you guys talking last time anyway. So it's worthwhile. No harm, no foul. Yeah, that's an interesting point that he brings up, that from this sort of scientific or materialistic sort of perspective of things as they are objectively, to look at some like brutal events such as the Holocaust from within that framing it's almost like an unethical way to look at reality, that there is like you have to look at it from within an ethical frame over that of looking at it from within a objective framing, even to the point that like sometimes he brings up that to see things as they actually are can be just so disheartening and spiritually destroying, to you sort of have to reject the objectivity in that sense in order to retain, I guess, the more appropriate ethical vision. I don't know, some interesting thoughts. I think that like even if you are sort of a materialist, you have almost like a duty to retain a non-materialistic lens through looking at life through.
This leads my mind to two different things. So on the one hand, we have the tragic optimism that was described by Viktor Frankl in his book, The Man's Search for Meaning, you know, which is basically the idea that the world is a horrible place, absolutely horrible, and horrible things happen all the time, but there's still good in there, and I think things can still be improved, so we shouldn't give up. That is basically that view. And the other thing it leads me to is all my thinking about courage, which I see as basically synonymous with faith. It's just a different perspective on the same thing. The courage to look at the world for what it is and try to look at it for what it is. That is something that can destroy you. Sure, it is deeply uncomfortable to look at things like Auschwitz in this way, but maybe it should be done. Maybe we need to see it for what it is, if we are to do what we can to avoid it. So I then have to wonder, what does this have to do with this idea of Christian atheism? But that whole perspective idea, I think it flies in the face of tragic optimism, and every idea of courage and faith that I can see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, can we look at some of the most tragic, suffering, painful, evil, wicked events and face them for what they are, and not despair? And Frankl said, well, you've got to find meaning right there in the heart of it. I think within Christianity, certainly, what you have is that God shows up in the God-forsaken place, such that even God has cried, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani.
Yeah. Which, by the way, implicates that it's not actually God-forsaken, because God appears there.
Yeah. Yeah. Where can I go from your presence, says the psalmist back in the Old Testament. And apparently you can't even go to a God-forsaken place. Which is not to say that we cannot feel utterly abandoned and forsaken by God, because even God the Son was on that Black Friday. But that's, yeah, so one of the massive differences between Christian atheism and Christianity is that I would say it's because of the fullness of God that he envelops even those nether regions of darkness and suffering. And I wonder whether Žižek would say it's actually the emptiness of God that is the most divine thing.
Right.
So that you come to some kind of situation where, okay, I'm feeling God forsaken. Well, there is meaning right here. And whatever the cross means, it means that I can find virtue, I can find courage, I can find something to live for.
Like Frankl did.
Like Frankl did, right? Yeah.
Yeah. It seems like for Žižek, his Christian atheism is that there are the two significant like instances when one can truly be a Christian, when you're there on the cross undergoing suffering and having this sense of abandonment, and that's when you're with Christ in that same sort of moment. You're being exactly as he was. And the other sense is when we're stuck at this point of like all we have are each other. We can't rely upon anything else, and that's sort of this desperate act of love towards one another without having any sort of Deus ex machina to sort of save us. And that's the other instance in which like to have a true authentic love for with another person in this sort of sense of desperation is to be similarly divine.
There's a really important book called The Crucified God by a Lutheran theologian, Jürgen Moltmann. And he was a German soldier. In fact, he was in the Air Force, in the Luftwaffe. He was shot down over Scotland, and he was a prisoner of war there. But among a whole lot of thought post-war, especially regarding Auschwitz, there was just a very profound move back to the cross, and to think the only God you can believe in now is the God of the cross, the God who Nietzsche said was the
suffering God.
The suffering God. Only the suffering God can help us. And so one of the big stories that Moltmann tells in The Crucified God is a story told by Elie Wiesel, who was a survivor. I'm not sure whether it was Auschwitz or one of the camps. And one of the inmates was hung for some totally trivial misdemeanor, and someone in the crowd, and of course everyone was forced to watch the hanging, and someone cried out, "Where is God now? Where is God now?" And Elie Wiesel was thinking, there on the gallows, there is God. And that became a massive part of this theology that's reflecting on and Moltmann says we can never do theology outside of earshot of the cry of dereliction. That's where we found our sort of understanding of God. So it's just fascinating to me how Žižek and Nietzsche and Moltmann and Luther come together here around the cross, actually.
Yeah, this is the most surprising thing about Žižek is how his Christian reading of his atheistic reading of Christianity is coming from a very theological sort of perspective, that he's drawing from a lot of like Lutheran and Catholic and many different theologians that are commentating on what it means to be Christian, and finding sort of this basis in which to, at least for himself, sort of make sense of the crucifixion as an atheist. And there's something I found just interesting. It's like, I'm curious, Glenn, why is it that you think that the cross has become sort of the primary symbol of Christianity rather than the sort of the empty tomb or
tomb or a book or the Bible?
It's just something.
Yeah,
go on.
Yeah, so what thought occurred to me while you were talking, Glenn, is that this might be one of the most important ideas in contemporary Christianity. That every time you kill someone unjustly, you kill God.
Yep. Like that which you do unto even the least of these my brothers, that you do unto me. Yeah.
Right. And so the idea of focusing on the cross, we want to avoid that.
There is that, and going right back to Genesis. So the image of God is put on man, and then in Genesis 9 it said, if anyone kills man, then their life is forfeit, because in God's image man was made. And so you're literally taking a statue of God and and toppling it, if you kill another. But then what is it that God himself would step into that role? What is it that God himself would be abandoned, that he himself would be crucified? And I think that is a notion that's just runs counter to, when you understand what crucifixion was for a Roman, it's the slave's death. It's the method of execution that if you're a Roman citizen, you would never get crucified. It's only for slaves or the worst criminals. And it's the imperial power saying, do not go this way of rebellion. This is what happens to you. You are scum. You are detritus. It was usually on rubbish heaps that people were, crucified and left to choke to death in the most ignominious way. The idea that this would be the greatest religious symbol known to man, utterly stunning. It's completely mind-blowing to think, Bill Hicks, the comedian who died back in the 90s, he said, it's like going to Jackie Onassis, with a rifle pendant on and saying, just thinking of John, Jackie, just thinking of John. like the idea, or wearing a gas chamber around your neck or something like this. The idea that God would show up as the victim. You look at the scene of the centurion. He is the incarnation of imperial power. And on that end of the spear, he's thrusting it up into Christ. And to think, where does God show up? To see if he's alive, and the blood and water comes out. On what end of that spear is true power found? Well, earthly power is found on one end of the spear. Apparently, God is on the other end of the spear as the victim.
Yeah,
it's the most revolutionary thought.
Yeah, look back to Nietzsche. God is dead, and we have killed him, and so on.
Yeah,
right.
And so on.
And I think the only answer to the death of God is the dying God. Like I really think you either go with the dying God, or the death, or you go with Nietzsche.
What about the Holy Spirit?
I think he's with the dying God. Yeah.
Okay. What about the resurrection?
So the resurrection is the vindication that yes, indeed, this is the Lord of the cosmos. This indeed is the operating system of reality. I believe in the physical bodily resurrection of Christ, and I think it's important.
As you're supposed to, yeah.
As I'm supposed to, yeah. And because it's extraordinary that not only our understanding of the cross, but our understanding of everything else in the light of the cross has exploded from Easter Sunday 2,000 years ago. There has been an explosion of this movement that has taken the cross as its centerpiece, and it has upended our notions of morality and science and charity and education and all these kinds of things, and founded it on the idea of
the empty cross, usually.
The empty cross, yeah. Although interestingly, the very first depiction of the cross in any kind of art was actually graffiti. It's called the Alexamenos graffiti. And it was by a Roman sort of caricaturist. And he did this cartoon of a cross, and there's a donkey on the cross, like representing Christ. And then there's this idiot Christian with his hand in salute to the figure on the cross that's just a donkey being crucified. And the caption just says, Alexamenos worships his God. And I think that gets to the heart of, what's the cross for a Roman citizen? It's like, you got to be a donkey to die on the cross. And the Christians are coming along saying, no, that's our God. Yeah, we're with the donkey, actually. Yeah. And yet that revolution has taken over the world. That's where I start to believe in the resurrection. Because
a parallel. I'm sorry for interrupting here, but
I was speaking too long. Sorry.
Yeah, when you look at this whole idea of being assumed innocent until proven guilty, a lot of people don't like that idea these days. Understandably so, because we want to judge, right? But the people who take the side of the judged in that case are doing the same thing. They're basically saying, that's our God you're killing, basically. And just like to point out, a lot of atheists and a lot of Christians are doing that. And most of those atheists come from the Christian tradition, so maybe there's something there. Though, at the same time, I'm thinking about this whole Christian atheism thing, and I'm thinking of it in two different directions. So there's the atheism comes out of Christianity, or modern atheism comes out of Christianity kind. and it is the kind of person that I represent, basically trying to be the best person I can be while functioning with other people and trying to relate to them as best as I can, something like that. And then you have this other possibility that, after all, when you remove Christ from the picture, when you remove the idea of God from the picture, you remove the guarantee, right? So people have to step in to ensure that things happen as they should, or a lot of people seem to think so, at any rate. And this frequently leads to assuming righteousness, and maybe this is why some, let's say, Christian atheists cannot tolerate looking at Auschwitz for this, because they don't have the courage or the faith to think that something good can come out of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. What gives you courage to look at these elements of the world that are just so dark, and to feel like there must be meaning there?
Well, for me personally, I think it's mostly pessimism. Actually, I don't see how we can get any meaning out of ignoring it. I think that's just going to create more problems.
Right. Right.
So you might say it's a faith in how the world works.
Yes.
A faith in the fact that things we ignore come back. Things we ignore don't go away.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And I think that's getting very, very close to Christian definitions of faith too. This is how the world works. I don't understand how we're going to get an Easter Sunday out of this Good Friday. But for me, I say it happened in the past. I think it'll happen again. But yeah, I think this is a death and resurrection kind of a universe. That's really where I come to. I think this is a kind of an Eastery kind of a universe that goes.
The greatest things come out of the darkest points.
All of that, and why is every superhero film exactly the same? Well,
actually, this reminds me of. Have you seen the Warcraft movie?
No.
No, that movie is really awkward in some ways. It has this big emphasis on from light to darkness and from darkness light, which is the basically crux of the entire plot. It gets taken to some ridiculous levels throughout the story, but that's the same idea, right? It's except they say it both ways, that the light creates darkness and the other way around.
Yeah. I mean, there is an asymmetry between light and darkness, though, isn't there?
It's hard to see how light creates darkness except by its absence.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And I think lots of theologians, going back to Augustine, have made a lot out of that there's an asymmetry between good and evil.
It would be a different thing if it said shadow.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's the Christian story. You move away from light, and of course, to the degree that you move away from light, you're into darkness. What does the light then do? Enters the darkness in order to transform it. Who is Christ? Yeah. He's the light entering our darkness, etc. Yeah.
Like the hero myth.
Like the hero movies.
Mm-hmm. As John Peterson likes to talk about, with entering the belly of the whale to rescue the father and so on. Right.
And I'm trying to think. There was. I actually went to you might know John as a screenwriter. Christian somebody. He was a
Joseph Campbell.
And he draws on Joseph Campbell massively. Right. But he's basically a guy who kind of took Joseph Campbell to Hollywood. I was in on a lecture of his.
Oh, Robert McKee.
That doesn't ring a bell. But but Joseph Campbell brought into Hollywood. Yeah. Why is the hero beaten to within an inch of his life, and then what's going to happen? Death and resurrection. But I would make the point that I don't think it's just true of humanity in general. I think we've inherited this through centuries and centuries of Christian storytelling that has brought us to that kind of sensibility.
Yeah, it's funny. Like almost every heroic movie, there's always that sort of Christian arc of that moment of death and uncertainty, and then some sort of resurrection moment where the person comes back to life or something like that. And it's all present. It's it seems like the only way to make a story with a happy ending, or to make the most deep movie, is to have that sort of aspect to it.
Well, I think you have both Christian and non-Christian versions of that. You have the Christian version, which usually, okay, I need to parse this out, so bear with me here. So in the atheist version would, this is drawing on Jonathan Pajot, would basically, this is also a pagan version, would be doing things for himself to win something he wants, let's say. Whereas the Christian version introduces the idea of the hero as servant, the servant of all, as you might say. That's actually a title in a fancy universe I'm quite fond of. So we have this idea of the servant of all as the hero, and that kind of changes the flow of this pattern in how it turns out. So the hero wins something for himself. You can still have a happy ending, and you can still have that pattern, but the servant aspect, I think that's when you get the Christian part.
Right. And and I still think it's just a stunning historical point that erupting in the middle of the Roman Empire, where everyone's saying strength and honor, and even the Stoics who were into virtue, their virtues weren't so much about service, compassion, kindness, sacrifice, love. They're much more about wisdom and justice and those kinds of virtues. Coming right into the heart of that culture, coming off the back of a guy who was on the wrong end of a Roman spear and crucified as a nobody, as this 30-something-year-old.
Probably at the request of the rabbis.
Yes, right, yeah. Otherwise, he would have been stoned to death. That would have been the Jewish execution method. Instead, he was given the Roman execution method, and yet within 3 centuries, the empire that crucified him as a criminal is hailing him as a lord, and that to me is resurrection, right? It's at least a resurrection that is incredibly suggestive to me of the resurrection,
or a subversion. You might say, like how the resurrection story subverts death.
Yes. Eucatastrophe is kind of what Tolkien spoke about. The "eu" prefix means good, so it's a good catastrophe.
Euthanasia, beautiful death.
Right. Yeah. So the beautiful catastrophe is somehow, and it's about using the catastrophe on itself, using death on itself, killing death by dying.
Yeah.
Somehow the author of life, like Gollum. Right. Yeah. Using the power against itself. Yeah, it's a beautiful story, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's interesting, just from Žižek and also other people that have been trying to come to grips with morality within a post-Christian age, of how you can still have this, like, it seems like Žižek is trying to provide sort of this theological basis, I guess, or maybe a theological basis of living the Christian life without having to rely upon, to rely upon this sort of more metaphysical doctrines or beliefs that are just not live options for a lot of people nowadays. And it's interesting that there is still this sort of overlap between the Christians and the Christian atheists, that there is still such this high significance on the cross as being the most sort of significant way of being. And it is also interesting that kind of using his understanding of the Holy Spirit as sort of this egalitarian collective and so on, of this, there is this resurrection that takes place in us rather than in, say, a physical body of Jesus, but rather Jesus lives on in us when we are acting as Jesus would, or when we are...
It's like the awakening of the Buddha.
I'm not familiar.
It's like the what, sorry?
The awakening of the
Buddha?
It's
like the awakening of the Buddha. Yeah. Which is something that can happen in anyone. With the most famous Buddha just being the first, supposedly. Depending on the tradition you're looking at. And by the way, I should note about that thing about the Christian element of the hero being a servant. I think you can see some hints of that in Buddhism as well. And Buddhism predates it, so it's not necessarily it's not a novel idea in Christianity per se, but let's say novel to that area in the world.
It's funny, in kind of conversations with Buddhists that I have, we often get to a similar kind of point where we totally agree on the definition of the problem in terms of suffering, and I think you've got two hearts beating together when you've got a Christian and a Buddhist talking about suffering, because here's the person talking about the cross, and here's the person talking about the Four Noble Truths. Like suffering is everywhere, but it does seem to me that the Christian solution is the highest ideal, the one at the top of the dominance hierarchy, whatever, the ultimate reality, engages and precisely refuses to detach, but actually embraces God-forsakenness and embraces the suffering on behalf of the beloved. Whereas, the Buddhist friends I talk to kind of say, no, well, we're more into the detachment thing as the solution for suffering. I think that's quite a significant difference, I would have thought.
Yeah. And I would like to point out about the difference. I think the difference is something that is available to the public in Buddhism, but that isn't part of the whole state of being a Buddha, because it is, at least as described, it's frequently described as being an idea of essentially just walking the golden mean. Mm-hmm. So basically like Aristotle's ethics.
Yes, but Jesus was not a good Aristotelian.
No, but he doesn't have to be. But the point here is that it's not advocating detachment per se. It's advocating a healthy balance of detachment and attachment.
Yes, yeah. Whereas I do see Jesus going all in.
Yeah, and you could ask, of course, what is a healthy balance of attachment, and when, and where? It's not obvious that it's the same at all times.
Right, and I think at that point there's a parallel discussion to cross and resurrection. If you're all cross, then you're all victim, and it's a race to the bottom.
Right.
Yeah, there's got to be resurrection. There's got to be a fullness that can then pour out to the person in the pit, rather than just lording the person in the pit.
Yeah, or you might say there has to be a light at the end of the tunnel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is, but to
so there has to be a light in Auschwitz.
Yeah. And yeah.
There's this quote. I think it was from a movie, sort of commentating on Auschwitz. It was like this dialogue between two Jews, one that became an atheist and one that became a rabbinic priest, or a Jewish. I don't know the exact terminology.
Rabbi.
Yeah. There's a discussion that they had between them. I think it's from this movie. I might be drawing from something else as well instead. But there's sort of this question asked, like, if you were to look back at, say, this event or just some like very contextualized event that takes place in Auschwitz, of some German guard kicking an innocent Jew on the ground, breaking their ribs, something like that. And you were given the choice between, would I rather be the Jew on the ground being kicked or the German above him kicking him? Which would you choose? And I think it was sort of like an open question, but it's almost like that's an interesting light, I guess, at the end of the tunnel, and it's sort of also drawing from Viktor Frankl's logotherapy of actually like considering the counterfactual scenarios here. And like I think, yeah, I guess the Christian message, and also just the sort of progressive victimization message, is that it's always better to be the one being kicked than the one that's doing the kicking.
Or to put it a different way, it's always better to be the one suffering from an injustice than the one perpetrating an injustice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Why? And I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. But I think as a Christian, I think I've got a reason for that to be the case. And I admire your faith that without the reason that ultimate reality really is shaped by the victim, Jesus Christ, and that you can know divine fellowship with Jesus in choosing to be the victim. So I've got that. What is it that motivates you to be able to make that choice? to side with the victim and not with the perpetrator, because if life is short and this is the only shot we got, why choose to be the victim?
You asking me or John or just the audience?
Both.
So all, okay. Well, for my part, I tend to think that that's making actions that don't sit right with you corrupts your character. That it makes you someone you don't want to be, basically. And I don't want to experience that, which is why I try to avoid doing anything that seems wrong to me, such as, for example, kicking someone while they're down just for being what they are.
Right. Yeah. You can sort of just make that sort of, I guess, pragmatic argument that, like, for Raskolnikov, after having Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky's novel, after having committed the murder of the woman that basically deserved to be murdered, and it breaks your soul in a sort of sense. It radically undermines sort of your own conscience and your psychology to make it so that living with such guilt is impossible. And then there's the additional problem that most people have committed some sort of act such as that and live with a guilty conscience, and without having some sort of relief from that, life is suffering that cannot be sort of ameliorated. But I think that's why a lot of people do turn to Christianity, is because it does provide some sort of hope for existence past that aspect of guilt. Like, that's the thing within sort of progressivism, there is no grace offered to the German Nazi that was kicking the Jew on the ground. There's no way of reintegrating the enemy into the in-group. That there's, and it's not just progressivism, it's basically any sort of ideology that has this sort of in-group, out-group dynamics of, like, there are the oppressors and the oppressed. There's no...
Fascists and communists, for example.
Yeah, there's no way for forgiveness. That not just in theory, but even in practice, you find it hard to really see that anywhere.
Yeah, that's very profound. That it's not just about, would you rather be the perpetrator or the victim? What are you going to do about the fact that you have been a perpetrator to some degree or another? That's a very profound and very Christian concept in terms of original sin, but progressives tend to have original sin but no redemption. So all the guilt and none of the forgiveness.
But we're not here to harp on progressives.
You're right. Yeah. But the other thing that was interesting about your answer, John, is that you went to a story, and a profoundly Christian story by a profoundly Christian author. And I think that is part of our moral formation. We can't help but place ourselves in a story and see ourselves as particular characters in it. And that by itself is a profound thing. But I also think you can't just have stories that just point to each other. It's just like Dostoevsky's story, which is just a little bit like Tolkien's story, which is just a little bit like Lewis's story, which is just a little bit like this. Is there anything underneath that is grounding all of those things?
That's where theory like theory of the archetypes could come in handy, right? The idea that these patterns that the stories resemble all come out of something that is intrinsic to human existence that people can identify and draw on and represent.
Right. And it sounds very much like Cross and Resurrection.
Yeah. And then you ask, right, is the archetype as we represent it real? Or is what we're trying to represent real? Or can both be?
Yeah, wouldn't it be good if both were true?
Yeah. Would it be good? Well, that's the thing, right? Wishful thinking is not something that you accept if you want to be absolutely honest with yourself, right? If you want to find the truth.
Well, but I mean, you want to find light in Auschwitz. Is that not wishful thinking?
It is, like I said, I think it comes from pessimism. So.
Yeah.
And similarly, I think if you look at people like Viktor Frankl, he in his book he basically wrote that he was trying to solve the meaning crisis before people even called it that, with his discussion of existential vacuums. So that was not a religious project. That was a kind of cross-religious project that's tried to present something so everybody could get something good out of. regardless of how they thought about the religion, regardless of what they thought they believed.
Yeah,
but he himself had been formed by a heck of a lot of stories that were biblical stories.
For sure.
Yeah.
And I think that
not
probably
necessarily Christian though.
That is probably one of the areas of improvement, I guess, within Christianity, is that Christianity is so, I guess, primarily focused within framing things all back to Christ and within Christianity, that it's hard for it to have any sort of presence or grip within people that have just found Christianity to not be a live option for them. Like, that's the thing. Like, people are so engrossed within their culture that to get sometimes to advocate that they become Christian is to have them reject the entire culture that they've been brought up in. And I think, in a sense, like, especially like if you're Jewish and you have this history of the Holocaust, and that's such a culturally significant moment for your Jewish and heritage, that to become a Christian almost in a sense seems like a betrayal to all of your predecessors that died in the Holocaust. And I think that, well, I think maybe Jews have a good, I guess, reason for not becoming Christian in this, for some of those
especially
reasons.
if they blame the Christianity that was preached, or the false Christianity that was preached by the Nazis as part of the cause for their persecution.
Right.
Yeah. No, 100%. Certainly within the New Testament, it's presented as here is, us Gentiles have been grafted into the Jewish vine, and we are the total outsiders coming in on this ancient, thing. But yeah, for all sorts of historical reasons, there, it makes Jewish evangelism very fraught and difficult. But I I was speaking to a guy just before lockdown, so just whenever that was, about 3 million years ago.
Something like that.
Something like that. But we had the most profound conversation about Job. And it was just, and in talking about Job, it was a bit like talking about Dostoevsky, or a bit like talking about Tolkien. It's a bit like, talking about any of these stories, because that too, as strange as the book of Job is, you start out in this wooded place with everything being hunky-dory, and then somehow through the devil, there is a cataclysmic fall.
It's not the devil, it's Satan.
The Satan, yes.
The accuser. Part of God's court who keeps him in check, basically, by challenging him when he goes too far.
Yeah,
it's not the same as the devil. It's been associated with the devil, but it's not the same, strictly speaking.
It's not the same title. I would say it is the same person, but there is debate about that. But interestingly, the devil is not a massive player in the Bible at all. Like, he shows up in Genesis 3 again in a wooded place called a garden, where this one guy is over a whole bunch of animals, the same as he is in Job, and there's a fall through that figure. Again, he's not called the devil there; it's the serpent. Yeah. But the devil is not a massive player in it. And then he shows up tempting Jesus in the wilderness, and he shows up again at the end. But the shape of Job is going down into this heck of a lot of suffering. And then actually there is a happily ever after, which is the most extraordinary, almost Deus Ex Machina kind of thing. The final chapter, suddenly Job has twice as much wealth as he had, and he gets,
feels like it was tacked on.
It kind of does. But even within just the Hebrew Bible itself,
it stands out.
It stands out, and they had to have a happy ending. It had to be a comedy rather than a tragedy.
Right.
And that's interesting. Is there a comedy for the Jewish story? And I would say the comedy for the Jewish story is that the Lord embraced our tragedy and rose up again to give us the happily ever after. Mm-hmm. And so I would say it is becoming. It is to own your Jewishness fully, to come home to the Messiah. I would say that. I'm a Christian.
Yeah. I think there's a hard line to really cross with that, especially with the significance of the Holocaust within Jewish heritage. Of trying to turn that into a comedy is something like strictly taboo. To even probably, what is it? Is it Jerry Lewis? He wanted to make this movie about this clown that was in Auschwitz, trying to make people happy at it.
Okay. Life is Beautiful is that kind of story, isn't
it? Yeah, it is, and
yeah.
it's very hard to sort of reframe that story as a comedy without. It seems like almost like a betrayal to the people that had to undergo that suffering. It's almost like we have to see it as fully evil in a sense, and we can't have any sort of redemption coming out of it. Yeah, go ahead.
At the same time, it is absolutely not a false statement to say that it was a good thing that Viktor Frankl's book *Man's Search for Meaning* became as it was because of his stay in the camps.
Yeah,
it wouldn't have been the same. It wouldn't have been as valuable if it wasn't for that. So that's something good that came out of it, and you can't deny that, even if you think that generally more bad came out of it than good.
And it's especially interesting for Viktor Frankl himself that if he were given the option to not have undergone his time in Auschwitz, he would not have done otherwise. And I think
he did regret his decision.
Yeah. I think for the Russian author within the Gulag that wrote the Gulag Archipelago.
Solzhenitsyn.
Yeah, Solzhenitsyn. He had a similar sort of understanding of this having undergone this suffering was what shaped his character to the point that he would not have wanted to have done otherwise.
Which gels with what Žižek says about God coming down. You know, that it's not this you get plucked up from the pit and somehow, you know, transported into the ninth dimension where there's Novocaine bliss forever. It is, as Elie Wiesel said, you know, when they heard, "Where is your God now?" He's on the gallows. Like it. So it's not even the instrumental goods that could be derived from that evil. It's not even doing that calculus or playing that game. Like first and foremost, the Theology of the Cross says, I don't know why, but God has embraced even that, so that even the God-forsaken place is not godless.
I want to try to pull this back to Žižek a little bit, because I'm wondering, what do you guys think his opinion of Christian atheism's perspective on things like this discussion about looking at Auschwitz for what it was? What do you think his opinion of what Christian atheism entails about that is?
That's a good question.
Because I can't really tell from the clips.
He said in the other lecture of God in Pain that he thought a more Christian reading of Life is Beautiful, rather than the child like buying into the masquerade that the father was trying to put up for him. Like the father's trying to make Auschwitz sort of bearable by pretending this is all a big game, and
telling him lies.
Yeah, there's going to be a reward at the end. He thought Žižek thought that the more Christian sort of reading of that, like the more appropriate Christian ending, would be if the child knew that the father was lying to him the whole time. That this sort of shared lie is what makes this shared lie makes suffering bearable and able to be lived through.
And a comparison that would be Santa Claus, for example.
Yes.
That most people agree is not real, even though in a sense he actually is, and it's actually undeniable. But that's a different discussion. So
he's a horrendous moralist, though. Yeah.
Sure. But anyway, the comparison to Santa Claus is one thing, but I seem to recall, this might be some kind of Mandela effect, but I seem to recall him also suggesting that while the child knew that was a lie and played along with it to satisfy his father, it turned out that it was actually a game in the end.
Mm-hmm.
I seem to recall that as well.
Maybe.
It's worth thinking about. Yeah. But I think, I would come back to just, is it more or less difficult to have a metaphysical belief like I do, that actually ultimate reality has passed through God-forsakenness and come out into the light, and therefore I can with those lenses on interpret the horrors of today with that optimism, or or even with that pessimism, as you know, because God joins us in the darkness. I don't know, is that more easy to believe or less easy to believe than to embrace that outlook of life without the metaphysical underpinning?
It probably depends on what you emphasize, but I'm not sure exactly what to pinpoint for that. What you think is wishful thinking is one thing, because that depends. That determines what you're comfortable with accepting as such, right? So that would be on the one side, and on the other side, I'm not sure because I haven't really thought about that. But
that's interesting about wishful thinking, because because I guess like my danger from your perspective is I believe Jesus rose from the dead because of wishful thinking. But then my sort of mirror accusation to the Christian atheist is, well, you think you'll find a glimmer of hope in your present suffering, and that's you think you'll find a modern day resurrection. Why should you?
Or alternatively, let's say that we have no better choice, kind of like the empiricist compared to the rationalist, where the rationalist saying we can get sure knowledge from rational analysis of things, and the empiricist is saying no, and the closest we can even get to sure knowledge is from looking at the world for what it is.
And
they don't say we can't get it, right? They say that's the closest we can get. That's opinion, right? So they're basically being more pessimistic.
But even the empiricist relies on a rational thought there anyway. But yeah,
they use it, but they don't think it gives them sure knowledge. That's the distinction. They just don't think they have anything better. So it's the same kind of deal, I think.
Well,
you can do well. Is it the case that you can do no other but hope in that situation? Because wouldn't Nietzsche say, well, can't you be the perpetrator and you know, can't you step on the other guy's neck and refuse to be the victim in that you know, position?
I think Nietzsche is often unfairly maligned on things like this. Is this something you draw from a specific book of his, or is it just a general social osmosis kind of interpretation of him?
All right, let's go on.
It doesn't seem to me that it reflects what I've seen in him. Is all I'm saying. Okay,
well let's leave Nietzsche out of it. But the understanding of, would you rather be this perpetrator or this victim in this situation? You could think to yourself, well, I can do no other but choose the victim situation. But I think even with the examples from Dostoevsky, and even with understandings of would I be able to live with my own guilt, I can also tell other stories of Nazis who were executed and found guilty at the Nuremberg trial, whose last words were Heil Hitler, and thought they'd done absolutely nothing wrong. I can tell other stories. Why wouldn't I surround myself with those stories?
That's a
different example of the perpetrator versus sufferer situation that we discussed earlier could be, would you even be able to be the victim?
In what sense?
Like, we assume that we have a choice, right? But what if we're not strong enough to be the victim?
That's interesting. Yeah,
it does take strength to be the victim.
I was just gonna bring up that, like, in our actual struggles of like what it is to be a good person, we're never really confronted with choosing between either being the Nazi guard or being the Jew being kicked. We're usually presented with what appears to be, oh, you get to be the Jew that's kicking the Nazi guard because those are the evil people. And so, like, that's the ideal choice to make a retributive justice against those people that are truly evil, that deserve to have what's coming to them. And that's sort of... That's
often what goes into the stories that people like as well.
Yeah, that's the way in which people will be more likely to choose the Nazi guard it's from their own perspective. They're the hero in the story.
Yeah, we're always the heroes in the story. And we would rationalize it, and the Nazis did rationalize it. Yep. And there were many who escaped to South America, and they bounced their baby granddaughters on their knees and died rich people having stolen Nazi gold, and they rationalized it. You know, why not be that guy?
Do you believe rationalization or not? Do you believe it, or is it just something to tell other people to not have to deal with it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's definitely easier if you believe it, for sure. But then you have to make it strong enough that you can actually believe it.
There's that story of the Allies, when they sort of liberated some of these camps, they would bring members of the people from the village just outside the camps in to show them the bodies piled up, because they needed to know what was going on under their noses, because there was some degree of complicity in all of this. And there's the famous line from one of the mayors that said to one of the generals, "We didn't know, but we knew."
Right.
And it's that, we didn't know, but we knew. They knew something was going on, but we
knew something was going on and we didn't want to check.
Exactly. They didn't allow themselves to know.
Yeah, they're still complicit in their
that's all of us, right?
Yeah.
That's all of us.
If we ignore it, it goes away. Optimism, wishful thinking, you might say.
Yeah.
We sort of hide from our responsibility through the uncertainty of the situation by sort of
constantly.
Yeah.
Constantly. Yeah.
You might even say that's the original sin, though that might be pushing it a bit far.
Self-justification is right at the heart of the story, though. Like there in the Garden of Eden, this woman you put here, like Adam's just blamed everybody, like in
except
one line.
him,
Right.
Except himself,
Yeah.
All
right. Well,
and she blamed the snake.
Yeah. Her with the snake, and
then the snake didn't have a leg to stand on.
Good one.
Because we had to finish on a joke, right?
Yeah, that's good. All right, so we've gone through just over 2 hours. I think that's a good time to stop. But I was really happy with this. I'm very happy to be able to discuss this with both of you here. Hopefully,
wait, don't you want to do the last clip as well? You said you had 4.
The last clip is sort of long, like it's like 9 minutes, and it's also like broken up between some sort of like he's referring to a movie, and we don't actually have the movie that he's referring to.
Oh yeah, I didn't get that. Yeah. When I watched it, I didn't understand.
But and we sort of touched on most of the topics that he brought up in that last clip already. And just to sort of keep it at a nice
digestible
short 2 hours. Yeah. But anyway, thank you both for joining me for this discussion. Hope to have more discussions similar to this on the channel.
It's been a pleasure. Nice to meet you, Glenn.
Yeah, you too, Trygve. Really enjoyed the conversation. Yeah. Where does the wishful thinking reside? Yeah, I'm gonna be taking that away with me. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah.
You're welcome.
All right. So I'll end the stream now.
Thanks, John.
There we go.
Yeah.